Hey guys, welcome back to another lesson in IB psychology. For those of you who haven't watched any videos from me yet, my name's Laura, and today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the sociocultural approach to psychology. So as I've said before, IB psychology paper 1 is divided into the biological, the cognitive, and the sociocultural approaches to psychology. And specifically what the sociocultural approach focuses on is kind of group psychology, looking at how we act differently when we're in groups compared to when we're on our own, how we identify with groups, how we're affected by social norms and other group settings and expectations, and also how we're affected by culture. So, cultural dimensions, cultural influences, and so on. So, what we're going to look specifically at today is a main theory within the sociocultural approach, which is social identity theory. So, to begin with, social identity theory is a theory that Tajfel and Turner came up with. And basically, the whole essence of the theory is that our social identity is the part of our self-concept that is based on what we know about group relationships. So it's separate from our personal identities. We might have an identity that we know ourselves as whatever nationality we are, and we have certain identifiers. But then when we're in a group setting, we then take on an extra identity, which is typically some type of shared identity. So for example, if you're in a band, then you might have also a group identity or a social identity with that band. So you identify as part of that group. And so one of the kind of underlying assumptions of the sociocultural approach is that we're social animals. And what that means is that humans just have a basic underlying need to belong and be social and engage with other people. And a way that we achieve that is by identifying with groups of people beyond just identifying as one individual. And what then furthers this is that we also have an innate need for self-esteem. We just like to feel good about ourselves. So humans typically try to engage in actions that will make us perceive ourselves more favorably, and also to think in ways that will make us view ourselves more favorably. And we can extend that to the groups that we're in. So we'll identify with groups that we see positively, or alternatively, if we're already in groups, we'll try to make those groups seem more positive and other ones seem less so, which I'll explain with more specific terms later on. But basically, it just means that we want to see ourselves really positively. And the way that social identity theory works and how we create these social identities is through three key cognitive processes. So the first one is social categorization, which is when we categorize people based on shared characteristics. So this is when we create an in-group and an out-group. And what that is the in-group, quite logically, is the group that we're in, and the out-group is the group that we're not a part of. So it could be as simple as you liking something. So maybe you like a certain sport, and that would be your in-group, and your out-group would be people who don't like it, for example. So it's all based on basically any type of identifying factor, but you place yourself either in or out of it. But social categorization in itself is just categorizing people based on these characteristics. We're creating the groups, we're not so much placing us in them yet. Because then social identification is when you identify yourself as part of groups. So that's the second process. And that's when you actively adopt that shared identity in group membership. And this already starts to have a positive effect on self-esteem. So there's kind of an emotional significance of this step. Then the third step is the social comparison stage. So that's when we make comparisons between our in-group and our out-group, or out-groups, because it could be several. And this is when we engage in something that's called positive distinctiveness. So positive distinctiveness is this idea where you judge your group to be better and other groups to be relatively worse. So we basically do this to improve our self-esteem. So we engage in positive distinctiveness to make ourselves appear favorably and others appear less so, which then will ultimately reflect well on us in the sense that we'll relatively look much better. And maybe here you can already see how this links to things like stereotypes, which is that people engage in discrimination and make others feel worse to potentially make themselves feel better. So there's quite a lot of layers to social identity theory and many applications. So what we'll start by looking at in depth is Tajfel and Turner. So Tajfel and Turner, like I said, are the ones who came up with this theory, and they specifically did this with a study which looked at something that they called the minimal group paradigm, which is this idea that we have a tendency to identify with groups that we're put in, even if those groups are completely random and trivial and not based on anything serious. So if someone literally just randomly allocated you to a group, you'd still want your group to do better than the other group that you weren't allocated to. So minimal group paradigm is what Tajfel and Turner set out to investigate, and they wanted to see how it affected behavior, essentially. So they got a group of 14 to 15-year-old British schoolboys and split them into two groups. And they ran two different types of experiments. So in one experiment, they divided them up randomly based on whether they over or underestimated the number of dots in a picture. And in the other experiment, they were grouped based on their preference for an artist, so either Klee or Kandinsky. But it was actually a completely random grouping in both of these versions. They basically just wanted to randomly split them up and see if they'd form group alliances, essentially. Then they played games together, some competitive games, and then they were asked to allocate points or money to either their in-group or out-group based on certain options they were given. So they could give a certain number to the out-group, and that would mean a certain number for the in-group, and vice versa. They were basically they had to allocate this, and it was based on some matrices they were given. So they were given set values. And they wanted to see how they divvied this up. So what they found was that, as expected, they allocated more points to their own group when they were given the option to. So if it was purely a external group decision, in the sense that if it was only about giving points to the other team and they weren't able to give any to themselves, then they showed complete fairness. Then they allocated as many points as they could to the other team. But if it was an intergroup decision, so you could give to yourself, your own team, and to the other team, and you had to kind of weigh up who got how many, they'd give as many as possible to themselves. And interestingly, what they found beyond that was that actually the participants wanted to maximize the difference between the groups more than they wanted personal gain. So what that means is that, for example, rather than allocating 25 points to themselves and 19 to the other group, they'd rather instead allocate 7 to themselves and 1 to the other group. They wanted to maximize that difference. And so that might seem like it would be counterintuitive. You might think you wouldn't do that, but actually this paradigm seems to show that they'd rather have a bigger difference between groups, a bigger relative difference, than to actually win, technically have the highest amount of points, even if this was money, because it could be points or money. And so they essentially discriminated, is what they were doing. They were creating false differences between the in-group and the out. They were creating an out-group even though it was based on pure randomness. So the study supports social identity theory by showing that we are just people who naturally like to make categories, and we like to try to perceive differences and try to maximize those differences and identify with what we perceive as the favorable group. One thing to bear in mind is that we can evaluate the study to say that there might be demand characteristics, because since the boys were doing this unnatural task of allocating points or money, they might have realized what the study was about, and then they might have acted in line with what they expected the researchers to want to see or to be manipulating. So we just have to bear that in mind, that it is a lab study in that way, that it's not completely naturally set. So that is the first study. The second study we're going to talk about is one by Cialdini. And this study was looking to investigate our tendency to associate ourselves positively with a group, and especially publicly. And that's what we call basking in reflected glory. So it's if your group does well, we have a tendency to want to identify with them, whereas if they don't do well, we don't really show that tendency. So what they did is basically the participants were US college students across 7 colleges in the US. And they basically observed them in these large lecture halls the Monday after a Friday night football game. And what they were looking to see was they wanted to investigate if the clothes that students wore after a big football game was associating them with the group identity of that school, of that team, essentially. So they were looking to see if they wore like the college jersey or sweatshirt if the team won compared to when they lost. And so what they found was that, not surprisingly, if the team had won on the Friday, they were more likely to wear clothes that reflected their school or team membership, whereas if they lost, they weren't very likely to wear it. So it's basically basking in reflected glory, is that they wanted to share that win, share that positive identity as a group, whereas if they didn't identify with, there was no win to identify with, it was a negative identity, they didn't want to have that identity thrown upon them, they just didn't really show that identity. They then took it a step further and also interviewed students about the performance of their school team after the game. And they found that if the team had lost, they tended to talk about the team using the word they, so kind of third person, whereas they used first person if the team had won. So they'd say, we did really well, oh, we won, etc., if they'd won. Or if the team had lost, they'd say, oh, they lost, they didn't play so well, etc. So it's interesting that people basically want to positively associate positively when their public image is at risk. So they want to look good publicly is essentially what this study showed. One thing to bear in mind is it's actually quite good ecological validity for this study because it is a natural setting. They were literally just talking to students after a game and observing what they wore. There wasn't much interaction, especially in the observations of what they wore. So they weren't really interfering with anything there. But one thing to bear in mind is there might have been other reasons for wearing the clothing. For example, it could have been a tradition at the school, or it might have been something people have been encouraged to do, or had been posted or messaged about. So we can't be entirely sure, which is the downside to kind of more naturalistic observations, is that we can't really rigorously isolate those variables. But this does ultimately show that we do, as people, just generally seek positive identities, and that we are influenced by our group memberships. So you will always typically be more positive towards what your group represents, and you will like to identify with groups that reflect you in a good light. So we're always striving for positive distinctiveness, both for ourselves, but also specifically for our groups, and that's what we form our groups based off of and how we represent them. So as well, one thing to bear in mind with social identity theory is that there's a lot of pros and cons to it. So in terms of pros, it explains a lot of why we form stereotypes. It kind of shows that in a good way, and also other associated behaviors, so like ethnocentrism and norms and so on. It basically explains that indirectly. It also shows that conflict isn't necessarily needed for discrimination to occur. Actually, this can stem from a much more basic level of just pure in-group versus out-group identity formations. And it also just is very well supported by a lot of research. This makes sense, as I'm sure you can tell, and is really well corroborated by research within psychology, and explains things like crowd theory as well. So why people riot, for example, they see this in versus out group, and they want to react because they're striving for this positive distinctiveness. A weakness, however, of this social identity theory is that it doesn't take into account personal differences, which is something you can often use as a critique in your psychology essays for the sociocultural level, is that there isn't, when you're looking at a group, you have to remember that each person is still an individual, and feelings of identity can really vary from person to person. So some people might be antisocial, so they won't have these same rules apply to them if they don't really identify with a group so much. And some people can have a stronger personal identity than their group identity. They might identify with a certain characteristic they have over and above a group identity. And also just generally, this is something that is a great key term to use in IB psychology. It's what we call reductionist in isolation. So on its own, this theory doesn't really accurately represent the world because we need to take into account things like individual differences. We need to consider that people's beliefs are usually a product of their cultural environment. So culture plays a big part. So basically, try to remember that key term. If you can throw that into an essay and explain it, that would be great. So just reductionist in isolation basically means that you can't just reduce everything to this one point. If you just isolate this one thing, it's not going to explain a whole behavioral phenomenon. Human behavior is really complex. We can't explain it with just one thing. And then equally, there's lots of other factors beyond that as well that aren't considered. So it doesn't really explain why, for example, in-group favoritism can lead to violent behavior towards out-groups. So it doesn't really explain the violence and so on. And ultimately, also at the end of the day, a lot of this research is quite artificial, really, because a lot of the setups are quite laboratory based. So for example, the Tajfel and Turner study, that's quite an unnatural setting, so we can't be entirely sure about the conclusions, but we do get a great indication of social behavior and why these things happen. We just need corroboration from other types of research and from other approaches within psychology. So it's always great to consider it all as one big thing. So I hope you guys learned something new today, and I hope you feel like you understand social identity theory better now. If you're interested in one-on-one tutoring, getting more tailored lessons online, then check out the link below to Lanterna Education, and Lanterna will be able to set you up with either myself or one of our other great tutors, and you will be able to get more help within psychology or any other IB subject. Thanks for your time, guys, and see you next time.